Well, as regular viewers will know, I remain flabbergasted and deeply disturbed by the lack of moral clarity in Australia about what happened on October 7 in Israel. The leaders of our universities, most of our media, and the leaders of our almost 1 million strong Muslim population clearly think Israel are the bad guys. This moral inversion has enormous ramifications for our social cohesion. Piers Akerman is a respected Australian journalist, former newspaper editor and current columnist with Sydney's Daily Telegraph. He's written a powerful article for The Spectator Australia upon his return from a week's tour of Israel organised by the Australia-Israel Jewish Affairs Council, where he spent time interrogating an extraordinary range of sources from the Foreign Ministry, Defence, Palestinian Authority, survivors of the Nova Massacre, members from besieged kibbutzes and civilian reservists. Piers, thanks so much for joining me. What was it like walking around the massacre sites?
It's probably the most confronting situation that I've been in more than 50 years in journalism. I've been in war zones before, but I've never been on such an expansive killing field. And that's what this is. The only thing I could liken it to are the rice paddies in Cambodia, where Pol Pot's people slew millions of intellectuals and people who they just didn't agree with as they tried to take Cambodia back to year zero. And I have no doubt that those 3,000 Palestinian Hamas terrorists who invaded Israel back in October 7, just 9 months ago, had the same nihilistic outlook as Pol Pot's murderous followers. The scene where these people were at the Nova Dance Festival, and I remind your viewers that this is a music festival where young people, peace-loving young people, had gathered to celebrate their beauty, their lives, listen to music, and apparently even fly kites with messages of love across the no man's land to Gaza, were savagely tortured, some instances tied up, raped, murdered, and kidnapped, along with others from kibbutzes near the border. And those kibbutzes were founded by essentially Israeli socialists who also believed in a strong message of international love and harmony, and had helped Palestinians over the 70-odd years that they've been in situ. In fact, one of the survivors of the October 7 massacre from a kibbutz told me that he was a member of a volunteer group that took sick Palestinians from Gaza on a regular basis to hospitals in Jerusalem for treatment. And if it was a short-term appointment, they would wait for them in Jerusalem, which is 2 or 3 hours away, and drive them back to their homes in Palestine. If required, they had to stay overnight for treatment. Then another volunteer would return them. And these were the people who came across the border and committed these atrocities.
Yeah, well, Piers, we hear very little of what you've just told us in the mainstream media. Who knew that it was an invasion by 3,000 terrorists? That's a massive scale. It's an army almost. You also mentioned in your article that the Hamas and the terrorists have won the propaganda war. Why do you think it's been so hard for the truth about what's happened on October 7 to get through? Why is all we hear about the terrible, obviously, civilian casualties in Gaza, but the moral clarity about why this started eludes people today?
What I'm finding, Lyle, is that this triggered an outpouring of a shocking, what I will call Jew hatred, not just in Australia, but across the world. It's almost as if there was this underlying anti-Semitism waiting to emerge, an envy of a group of people who not all are religious, just happen to be a group of people who identify as Jews and by heritage or whatever. And we've seen this particularly in our universities, and I can only assume that this is a deep and underlying Marxist-based hatred of the other. And we've saw it in Britain and America, and Hamas has gone out of the way, particularly on social media, to weaponize this. And as we've seen, our police forces in Victoria and New South Wales and the ACT have done nothing to combat the marches of Hamas supporters to the Opera House in Sydney, to Federation Square in Melbourne. And where are the arrests being made? And they're not being made. And it's not as if these people would be hard to identify. Their faces have been captured on CCTV and on webcams and so forth. And you can't tell me that the attacks on the most probably secularly sacred place in Australia, our own war memorial in Canberra last weekend, where are the perpetrators of these things, and why aren't?
No, that's right.
It is shocking.
They should be have the book thrown at them. Piers, just going back to your trip in Israel, and what was the sense that you got about the progress that the IDF are making in Gaza in their mission to eradicate Hamas? As I said earlier, no one wants to see civilian casualties, but these terrorists are hiding behind civilians, using them as human shields. They've made good progress up until Rafah. Do you think the IDF can be successful in finishing the operation in Rafah? And why do you think after such good early progress, things seemingly have stalled?
Well, I think that both the IDF and the Western world totally underestimated the infrastructure that Hamas has built since it came to power, bearing in mind that they are the elected government in the Gaza Strip. And they've been the elected government since 2007. So they've had 16 and a half odd years controlling the thing. Now, one of the big mistakes that the Israelis made was that they thought that because Hamas was the government, they could deal with them in a responsible manner, as one would expect. And they focused their attention on Hezbollah, another Iranian proxy, which is embedded in Lebanon. And so all of their attention was directed to the northern border. In the meantime, Hamas was channeling every bag of concrete that was coming in as aid, every ton of steel that was coming in for rebuilding infrastructure, and they were channeling it into building an enormous structure of a network of tunnels, more than twice the size of the London Underground. And we're talking about tunnels the size you can drive trucks through. Now, why did the people of Gaza not report this? According to the opinion polls, 85% of the Gazans supported Hamas. Now, we don't know whether this was because they were under duress or because they ideologically believed in the extraordinary fundamentalism that Hamas, as with its Iranian masters, dictated. Because these tunnels were coming out in the homes of ordinary Gazans, except that those Gazans, as we've seen with the recent rescue of 4 hostages, were members of Hamas. And other tunnels were coming out in hospitals, which were run by the United Nations, in schools that were run by the United Nations, through their dedicated welfare program, UNRWA, which has been going since 1949 to support Palestinian refugees.
Yeah, so it's clear the UN have some complicity in this, which is quite wicked. There needs
Absolutely to be complicit.
Yeah. You mentioned in the article, Piers, that you were able to speak with Palestinian Authority figures. I'm interested in that. Where do they stand on Hamas, and how do they see a way forward for their people to live in peace side by side with Israel?
Well, over the last 25 years, I've met face to face with Mohammed Abbas and his offsider Ashrawi, Anan Ashrawi, who received the Sydney Peace Prize, by the way. I've found these people to be absolutely duplicitous in all their dealings with me and other Western media. They totally deny their pay for slay program, i.e., this is where the Palestinian Authority pays a stipend to terrorists who are incarcerated in Israeli jails, basically supports them and their families while these people take university degrees and so on. It's worth noting here that Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas in Gaza now, was one of the terrorists freed when 1,000 terrorists were traded for the body of one Israeli officer who they had kept as a bargaining chip for a number of years. And the Israelis always say that we will get every hostage home, dead or alive. But they freed this mastermind of this attack in that last trade-off. Now the Hamas is demanding 500, 600 terrorists be released in return for every hostage, dead or alive.
It's wicked, Piers. You mentioned Sinwar.
It's beyond wicked, Lyle.
Yeah, it is, and I wish the ABC knew that and our university vice-chancellors. Piers, you mentioned Sinwar. I'm intrigued that so much of the leadership, the high command of Hamas, are holed up in six-star hotels in Qatar. Qatar is obviously complicit as well. Why should why should we allow Qatar Airways to fly into this country, given they are collaborating with, essentially modern-day Nazis?
Well, you look at the politics of this, and it comes down to the domestic politics. As we can see right now, the Labor Party is struggling with one young Muslim woman in its own ranks because she's standing up for Palestine, and which is a proxy for Hamas. Qataris have been, one, funding Hamas, two, they're hosting Hamas, and three, they've now taken on this role as a peace broker. So explain to me the impossible conflicts that the Qatari leaders have. Now, our trade with Qatar, and we do trade with a number of the Middle Eastern nations and with Turkey. Turkey hosts Hamas as well. If there were any principle in our government, if there were any skerrick of a principle, we would be calling in the Turkish ambassador and the Qatari ambassador and saying, we have trade with you, and the Iranian ambassador. We have trade with all of your nations, but until you release the hostage, until you put pressure on Hamas to release the hostages, we are suspending negotiations.
We should absolutely do that, Piers. And what this means is we're all complicit, unfortunately, with this great evil. Piers, in your article, you also talk about the geopolitics, while we're on geopolitics, and you provide evidence of not just Iranian involvement, but also you mention involvement from China, Russia, and North Korea, what you call Team Apocalypse. Are we already in some sort of a proxy war against the West?
We have been for years, and we're just too blind to acknowledge it. The Chinese have been infiltrating Western nations, buying privileges at university, business through their real estate investments. We look at the donations which from time to time are revealed that have gone to political parties in Australia. But through such bodies as the Confucius Institute, which pump money into most of our leading universities here, as they did in the UK, as they did in the US, these people are buying influence. Now, our universities are absolutely complicit with the Chinese regime, and why we never call them out on their lack of human rights in regard to the Uyghur people and other minorities is beyond me. But Israel gets called out by the United Nations almost on a daily basis because the Western liberal democracies have lost sway in the UN. It's totally under the thrall of Russia, China, and the other autocratic, theocratic governments.
Well, we've lost confidence in who we are as the West, and we don't believe in our own legitimacy anymore. And of course, radical Islam and Russia and China, the enemies of the West, are exploiting that. Piers, back here at home, Australia's political leaders don't seem to be doing much to push back on hate preachers who have appeared on Sydney streets, in the aftermath of October 7, saying, I'm smiling, I'm happy. There's been anti-Jewish and even incitement of violence against Jews in Islamic centres and even at Lakemba Mosque. If the Muslim leaders are not clear about the evil that has been done in the name of their religion, how will their people, almost 1 million strong in this nation, have moral clarity?
I don't think that the Islamic leaders in Australia have stepped up at all. And I think that we seriously have to consider not only the hate speech laws, but our immigration laws. Why are we taking in so-called refugees from Gaza when we know what the majority of Gazans think? These people are coming in without proper security clearances. And now they're demanding, of course, that they be reunited with untold numbers of family members. Why are we taking in people from a body? I don't want to characterize all Muslims as terrorists, but why are we taking people who largely support terrorist organizations and, as we see through their imams, refuse to integrate into our society? Now, Australia was founded on the notion that you come here to be Australian. You don't come here to be a Turkish Australian or Greek Australian or Italian Australian or anything else. And you come here with an ideology, a wicked ideology, an Islamist ideology, which is dedicated to tearing down everything that the Western liberal democracies stand for.
Yeah, absolutely right. Piers, unfortunately, that's all we've got time for, but I really appreciate you sharing your insight. I'd encourage everyone to go to the Spectator website and read your article. It's very enlightening. You're not going to hear this stuff on the ABC. Piers Akerman, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Lyle. Thank you for inviting me.